When I was a little girl, I remember praying to God to be a good person, and oddly enough, it was a petition that came from me, not any religious dogma. I had a natural, devout love for God that has been a roller coaster through the years. Yet I did not mean it as someone who was bad, and though my father was already being verbally and emotionally abusive to me, his vitriol had not fully registered. Children, like puppies, are so pure that they do not see abuse as abuse. It's just rejection waiting to become love again. Thus, God became the father I never had, a similar dynamic I shared with my grandma. Comedian Neil Brennan once joked about how white wealthy men have the tendency to be atheists because they are God. You do not need to believe or ask any grand being for anything, like aid, when you literally own it. Everyone laughed, but it stayed with me, particularly the word need. My grandmother grew up dirt poor in Puerto Rico, and her experience in America was riddled with racism and bouts of depression, especially as the only family member besides my mom that stayed in the longest in the U.S. Literally every single one of my family members returned, while I traveled the world, instead feeling more comfortable as a nomad, which has its own daddy issues for its reasoning. Yet when I look at my grandmother's perseverance, it stems from her unwavering love for God. But this is not your Jesus Catholic God. When we speak of God, we often take the perspective of white Anglo-Saxons, which is also the same God most people attack as oppressive. Yet for Latinos and BIPOCs, God may take the image of the only blonde, blue-eyed baby born on the border of Egypt, but his essence is so much more colorful. He is the man that grew up with a poor single mom, a story I myself understand. He is the man that spoke about the oppressions of his community at every outing, to the chagrin of elders and people that really just wanted to finish their wine. He is the man that spent most of his life quiet and working at a service job, aka carpentry. For my grandmother, Jesus was an energy, not just an image. He was a being and a belief that someone out there understood and saw her pain in a world that would easily cause it, but never look at it or comfort it. In many ways, it was her only company, which is how he became my only dad, and the only man I could say, or to some imagine, ever loved me. To some extent, imagine, ever loved me. An alarming truth I swallow like a pill to admit. I can genuinely say I've yet to be loved, or at least loved well, by a man, and it is an experience I would love to know. Yet I cannot focus my whole life aiming for it. I've done that, and explains why I'm in daddy recovery. I think God is so unlimited because he becomes what we need or want him to be, which is why he can be a weapon against some and the little redemption song for others. He's the savior and the assailant because I see that in many ways he's a reflection of what we deem our higher self. For so long, God was a father to me because I genuinely believed if I had had a dad, my life would be better. And if I had had a good human being for a dad, it would be easier. Yet now, more grown and determined to be happier, when I see God, she is me. She's healthy, loving herself, rich, famous, and unashamed that those were her goals that manifested into truths. She provides, she prospers, she protects herself. It is why I say I'm God, because I have finally learned if he is all, then you have to be everything. Rather, if she is all. But, one of the weirdest dynamics between when I look at my mom and my grandma and myself, these three generations that kind of have had these sort of repetitive things. My grandmother was a single mother. My grandfather cheated, was very self-centered, very indifferent to my mom. And then she lands my dad, who's just hateful and malicious and also very cutting financially towards her. I think the difference between my grandfather and my grandfather and my father is my father was verbally and psychologically abusive to me. He was mentally and emotionally abusive to me and my mother. Whereas my grandfather, I think the painful, and I think I said this in a prior episode, what was so tragic about his dynamic with my mother and my grandmother was just this plain indifference. Like they did not exist, out of sight, out of mind. He didn't cause them harm. He didn't cause them help. He didn't cause them anything. He really did just exit. And my grandmother has had a really tragic life, as most Puerto Ricans have, being in occupied territory. Historically, we've had our bouts of obviously genocide committed against us, massacres, resources taken, all these scientific tests, even in the last 2 decades, Hurricane Maria, the earthquakes that have plagued us via U.S. fracking. So you take this island that has been so historically battered, and then its people go across the world. And, Puerto Rico has always been defined as it's Latino, it's American, it's Caribbean. And sometimes we have the tendency in somebody being so mixed or so full of everything. We have our indigenous ancestry, Black ancestry, Spaniard ancestry. Most of us have all three within us, like myself. There's just this feeling of when you're everything, you're oddly nothing. When you're a part of all, you oddly get treated like you're just not a part of anything. You're never full enough to be seen as enough. And all my family tried to make it in the US, and they went right back. They were like, we hate it here. I mean, because there is this expectation that in the US, you go there and it's that rags to riches dream. It's that if you have enough hard work and determination, you will go far and you will live this splendid, very spendy life. Like, you work hard, you'll get great money, and you will have so much fun because of it. And I think there are a lot of immigrants that does become their happy ending. We can't deny that it is a reality, but it's not a reality for so many people. Moreover, I think the cost, the mental and emotional cost, can sometimes not outweigh the material prize at the end. And I say that from my own experience. There's so many times in my life, and part of why I started Daddy Recovery, where it's just not only about the losses that I got because of my paternal abuse, but also how I define winning, and why I felt sometimes like even if I accomplished something, this emptiness. And it was because, was I chasing the approval and validation and what others felt should be my dreams? And that's very hard to decipher. I just started stand-up comedy, and I'm doing very well. People love it. But there are moments, I was always told you should do stand-up comedy, and I did it, and it's incredibly fun. It's very hard. It's exhilarating, and it's also like, but there, and I bring up that example because part of Daddy Recovery is this constant kind of, what is me? When you're told so much what's great about you, what's bad about you, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and you don't really have input in any of it, what you find is you grow up and you don't know. Like, I know I'm a good person, but I will never become a better person, especially unto myself, if I don't kind of take back my identity. And I think for my grandmother, that God became that way of kind of taking back her identity. And, you could just imagine 1950s America, 1960s America, 1970s America, how it treated Latinos, how it treated Puerto Ricans. She would talk about how much she cried just in, working. I think she came here when she was 16, and they just called her stupid, and she cried so much in the bathroom, and just so much depression. And my grandmother adores God. Like, you cannot F with Jesus. And I think in many ways, and I understand it as somebody who's struggled with their own depressions and is in this moment of kind of, I'm alone. And I saw a TikTok recently where a woman was saying, I'm 39. I don't really talk to anybody beyond work. I don't really have any human connection. Like, I could go days without calling somebody, without calling a friend, without calling a family member. And I could say that that's very similar to me too, where you're just finding yourself in this emptiness that you're trying to figure out how it was always there, because you don't have the distractions, the poor relationships, the poor job choices, the dreams that are there in your head, but they're not in your reality. And I think for my grandmother, God became a very sincere, beautiful coping mechanism. Like, a lot of people say, like, ask my grandma to pray for them, because they're like, when she prays, it actually happens. I think what's the irony for my my dynamics with my mother and my grandmother is that they're two of the most positive people that aren't necessarily positive for themselves. They're two of the most generous, compassionate, loving people you will ever meet that don't exactly hold those virtues for themselves. And I think my grandmother, more than my mother, what she does kind of subconsciously and inadvertently is give God the love that she doesn't give herself, because she's so frustrated by the tragedies, the traumas, the betrayals. Like, this woman has been torn up by family, friends, men. And it's like she made God this alternate version of her because he understands what pain is. You know, the carpenter, rejected by society, single mom, poor. And just what you find is, especially because God is just this intuitive, more sensory experience, sensitive experience, what you find is you start adding to his story and start adding to his feelings subconsciously, things that you experience. Like, she was talking about how, Jesus cried after John the Baptist, and he did, but I think it's like one sentence. But suddenly, as she described it, it became to her, especially as somebody who cried so much by themselves, would find themselves hiding in the bathroom stalls of her high school, just bawling her eyes out because they called her, racial slurs that they called Latinos. And she just felt so lost. And that moment after Jesus finds out about John the Baptist, it's like, I think it's a sentence. He basically just takes a boat and weeps. And it became this huge symbolism of those instances where you're so overwhelmed by the sadness caused by others, the injustice people cause to you and your family, that no matter how much you yell, no matter how much you protest, it continues because there's a whole system that backs it. He became her kind of existential friend. Like, she got it. I get it, Jay. In Gethsemane, when he cried by himself because he was so scared to kind of die for our sins, right? Isn't that the whole point of Jesus? To die for our sins, and kind of like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I think my grandmother definitely felt that in terms of when her family started heading back to Puerto Rico because they weren't making the economy that they thought they would. Moreover, they just weren't happy. It's a totally different culture, we're a different people, We may be owned by the US, but we're not like it. Like, it's the Caribbean, for God's sakes. And Latinos, man. She felt, she was having her own Gethsemane moment. I want to go back, but where are we supposed to go? Our island is owned, but when we come to America, we feel the ownership even more. Like, it's like, oh, now we're in the owner's territory. And she just felt super, super lost and sad. And just, where is my direction when nobody wants me? And sometimes I don't even want myself. And I think Jesus became this energy of unwavering faith and unwavering positivity that for a lot of us, it's really hard to get. And I think she kind of very intelligently and subconsciously made it something outside of her that came from within her, aka her relationship with Jesus. It's not me, it's Jesus. Jesus is showing me. It's not my intuition or my smarts. It's Jesus. Because I think for her, it's just, and it's something that I'm sure you as a listener go through. It's something that I go through. It's just really hard to love yourself when life gets hard. It's really hard, especially, and it's why I started Daddy Recovery. My dad abused me. But then I kept on finding boyfriends and friends and bosses that were exactly as abusive as him and as cruel and as vicious and hated me, but didn't want to say it because they were using me as some type of emotional pillow, creative pillow. Like, I just kept on finding the same toxic dynamics. And it's hard when you're kind of entrapped in these systems or spiritual dynamics that haunt you and hurt you, not to feel like you are the worst person in the world. And after a while, like somehow you deserve it. But at the end of the day, evil people have no right to be evil. John the Baptist should not have died. Jesus, whether you believed in him or not, was a good man. Whether you believed, the point is he did exist, there's this fantastic books about him as a social revolutionary. So not even as a messiah, just as a social revolutionary. And I feel like as I get older, my relationship with God ebbs and flows, because when I was a child, I didn't even know who God was in terms of religion, but I knew who God was in terms of me. Like I just had this really natural, gorgeous love for the universe, for this higher power, but like it was in me. And my dad was so evil, like mean. God doesn't love you. He loves me more. That's why he protects me. That's why he gives me money. That's why I'm traveling. You're not. It was just so, I felt like he took my actual dad. Because I was going to say, I felt like he took my best friend. But in truth, I felt like he took the one person, the one entity that I felt was paternal. Because I remember being a little girl and staying up at night and talking to God like he was a bestie. Because I was very lonely. My mother was working a lot. My grandmother, I love her, but the woman can nap. She takes about 15 naps a day. And she'll say, oh, it's because I'm older now. And I'm like, no, baby, you were always a sleeper. She just watches her novelas, goes to bed, cooks horribly, eats the horrible food, then takes another nap, So I had so much time by myself despite wanting company. And we were always back and forth, my mother and I, between Puerto Rico and in Puerto Rico, I would have all this family, but I didn't necessarily feel connected to everybody because, I was the tall one, the fat one, the funny one, I was entering their world. And my whole life, I felt like I was always entering someone else's world. Like I didn't even have my world. I was entering my dad's world. And I think mentally, he made me believe what he believed, which is if I am on ice until he calls me, I do not exist until he arranges a dinner. He really did treat me like that. And in my loneliness, there were just so many moments I really, really wanted somebody. And God filled that void for me. He became my friend, my partner, that fellow little girl to play with Barbies. And when he started to go for God, especially because he knew how much I loved God, it's like he materialized God in a way. God would give you money if you're poor, and yet we're poor and God's not giving me money. God would come in the form of love and friends, and yet I'm alone. I'm alone in my room, just drawing or writing poetry. And I've always ebbed and flowed because of that in terms of my faith, because he took something so spiritual, so internal within me, just a love for life, and made it like, if you don't have money, if you don't have fame, if you don't have your siblings, if you don't have your friends, then why are you on earth? Clearly, God does not love you. You were an accident. And he was really just talking for himself. And I think now, as I do Daddy Recovery, I do my music, I'm kind of just trying to spiritually heal and revamp myself. I'm trying to be so unabashed about what I want from me. I want to be rich. I want to be famous. I want to sing. I want to act. I want to have honesty in my life. I want to have a good partnership. And I want all these things without chasing them and without letting what other people think I should have and go for distract me. And that's really, really hard. And I think that's really, really human. And I think that explains why in some ways my grandmother made up God, or made that dynamic with God. You get so pushed around, and that stability has to come, even if it's from within to outside in the form of this Jesus that you made up in your head. Whether or not he exists, how he exists within you. So yeah, this is daddyrecovery.com. If you heard any noises, it's because my dog finally got activated while I was recording because he just loves me. Check out Business Class out May 24th. Get excited.